out to a number of our events. In essence, the diagram shows all of the different work that's taken place as part of planning in the West End, and it goes back to 2010 with a number of initiatives that were underway at that point in time. One, council directed staff to take a look at best practices as part of undertaking a new community plan initiative. So city staff worked with a consultant and stakeholders from across the city to start to put together what a best practice community plan process would look like. Meanwhile, in the West End, there were a number of controversial rezonings that were taking place. So two things were being done at that time as part of a lot of the feedback that was coming into the city. One, WEMAC, the West End Mayor Advisory Committee, was struck to help advise council about the rezoning applications and put forward recommendations of core communities' concerns and what the values were for the community. And it was made up of West End residents and was to reflect the balance of residents that were renters versus owners, different age groups. Meanwhile, the city undertook a community survey to also understand the prevalent issues and concerns. And this was done in 2010 as well. This survey went out as really the first survey to gauge people's primary interests, so we could have an understanding as part of starting to frame up a community plan process, starting to frame up in terms of reference what were the key things we needed to focus on. That led to late 2011 and 2012 when we took what was a general terms of reference, which would apply to any new community plan process. We started to refine that terms of reference into the West End terms of reference. This is the document that guides the process for our community plan, and a document that council approved last year in March. And that was prepared in addition to using the best practice research through a number of stakeholders discussions where we started to refine the process for the West End specifically. So I'll touch on the process from there on in a second. Where are we today? We have the draft West End Community Plan that came out on Tuesday. Reflects the directions that we brought out in June. As part of the community plan, we have two attached documents. One is a rezoning policy that I'll speak to that starts to get at some of the key concerns about the lack of clarity about how and where rezonings can be considered in the community. And the second is an infill guidelines booklet, and I'll talk about what that is. That relates more to the laneway infill. So, after the pre-launch, which I just went through, our terms of reference asked us to focus really on the core issues, the core concerns. One, diversifying the housing stock in the West End and deepening the affordability of the housing that we have or new housing that's being built. Two, protect our heritage assets in the West End, which many folks contribute to helping define the character of the West End, which we cherish. Three, really look to help work with local BIs and local businesses to start to revitalize some of our local business areas, or commercial streets. Four was improve the walkability. So West Enders love to walk, and I'll get into this in a second, but really look at opportunities to improve the walkability within the community for all ages and abilities. Addressing on-street parking concerns. We know that on-street parking is tight. As part of this plan, we wanted to try to address that. And lastly, but certainly not least, looking at our facilities, our community facilities, and looking at options to renew these over time, over the 30 years as part of the West End Community Plan. So phase one. Phase one started April 2012. This is where we kicked off the community plan process formally. Phase one, we really wanted to understand what were the community values. This was our chance to start getting out as much as possible, talking to people who live here, work here, come here to have a good time, whether it's patroning the commercial streets or it's coming down to the beach. We wanted to really get an understanding what were the important values and what were the ideas, interests, and opportunities that we wanted to be able to use to start framing the community plan. So what's important to people? Meanwhile, we also did a bit of homework and created the West End Community Profile. And this is a document that includes information about demographics and housing, jobs, includes information about the heritage assets, transportation, transit, a variety of different topics that affect the West End. As part of this first phase, which lasted about 8 months, we spoke directly to over 2,800 people through a variety of different techniques, and we were trying to balance techniques where we were out with smaller groups having more of a discussion and dialogue, which occurred through community circle discussions. 59 of those took place. We had walking tours. We started to actually walk through the community, understand the green leafy character that we do love, understand what's important on the commercial streets. We had 39 people attend those. We had a photo competition to really understand what the great places and spaces in the community are for people that live here. We went to as many of the community events as possible, which ended up being 18 during this phase. Set up our booth, and we tried to one, build awareness about the planning process, and two, ask questions about some of the values that we were looking at and we've been hearing about. We undertook 3 asset mapping sessions looking at the arts and culture in the community, understanding where opportunities may lie. And we had the Ideas Fair, where we invited some of the local community groups to come and share their ideas initially. That came from the community circle discussions that were taking place. So that was our first phase. At the end of that phase, we checked in through a set of open houses, asked people, did we get it right? Did we get our values right? Did we get the ideas and opportunities right? Is this a good starting place to start more detailed planning? We heard overwhelmingly that there was support. The next phase, phase 2. So with that strong foundation, background information, the values, we were able to start launching into what we call the emerging directions, starting to frame up beginnings of a plan. So starting to translate some of the values, some of the concerns, the issues, into a plan. So as part of this phase, we developed this character-based approach to the West End Plan. And this is something that's been absolutely crucial to everything we've done. It really defined how we were to move forward as part of this plan, and it defined 3 distinct areas that I'll talk about in a second. Part of this phase is part of the emerging directions to really get a sense of how we could land some of the values, how we could land some of the new ideas that were coming out. We undertook survey work. Again, we launched a set of workshops for both our commercial streets, so trying to get into a bit more details, trying to focus our discussions, commercial streets, and then in the laneways, which we had heard in phase 1 were a true opportunity to explore. And then we partnered with a community group to explore some of the local food opportunities for growing, production, selling, distribution. So as part of that phase, we ended up really with the emerging directions map plus associated directions that again we brought out at a set of open houses and received support on. So we felt confident, let's take it a step further. Phase 3. Phase 3 was really about taking the emerging directions and starting to land on more concrete directions. So in phase 3, again, doing a lot of outreach through questionnaires, workshops, walking tours, community events, workshops. We ended up taking the emerging directions and refining them. Some we heard there's a lot of support for, and others we had to do a bit more homework on and start to tweak. And I'll touch on those in a second. So as part of phase 3, in June, we ended up putting together the West End Community Plan Directions booklet and brought that out to a set of open houses to really gauge, again, whether or not there was support for the directions that we had landed on. And we received generally support, however there were some concerns, particularly around parking, which I'll talk about again in a second. So that's really taken us to where we are today. The draft, the directions that were reviewed in June, we've used those to pull together the detailed policy framework that is the draft West End Community Plan, the rezoning policy, and the infill guidelines. In terms of consultation, we used a variety of different methods, as I've mentioned. Some smaller meetings, more focused discussions, others larger kind of open house events. Overall, not including what our NCN, our Neighborhood Champions Network, had helped us with, we ended up reaching out to 7,144 different, what we call contact participants. That number may reflect people that filled out a questionnaire twice. We held, or hosted, or participated in over 100 different community events and meetings. So at some points it was usually about one per week that we were averaging. We undertook a number of actionable planning initiatives, and you may have seen these. These were little initiatives that we could land quickly to start one, building awareness about the plan, but starting to land some of the ideas that were emerging through the community. There was the actionable planning initiative on Robson Street that we called the urban pasture between Burrard and Thurlow, where there are 3 parking spaces that were transformed into a wooden structure that had seating and widened the sidewalk. There was some planting. The idea behind that was we were starting to test new ideas. How could we look at space a bit differently? How could we utilize space a bit differently? A lot about what makes the West End special is what we already have, and recognizing what we have and just building upon that, rather than starting from scratch. We were on Twitter. We have a listserv, an email listserv that we've been able to keep people updated through, and we've been advertising through 3 community-wide mailouts, through various newspaper ads, radio interviews, and posters as well. So we've done quite a lot to date. In terms of context, the West End, as you all know, is a remarkable place. When we looked at the history, right off the bat, looking at how the West End started out 130 years ago, and how it's incrementally changed over time. And we brought this out when we first launched the plan, phase 1. The question at the end was, what's next? We've incrementally changed over time. Started out with an idea, a plan. This was to be this is the West End, so you'd have English Bay, you'd have Cole Harbour up here. This would be Georgia here, Burrard here. This was a plan for what was supposed to be the city of New Liverpool. Predated the city of Vancouver, but it laid out the existing lot pattern, street pattern, and lane pattern that we have today. And it's one of the reasons that you notice, as soon as you cross Burrard Street, the streets all change. It's a different pattern. So we still have that legacy today. It wasn't until the CPR arrived, started bringing jobs and tourists to the area, that it started developing as a part of the city of Vancouver. Initially, first couple of decades, it was being built as predominantly single-family house neighborhood, with the suburbs. It had a mix of modest homes as well as lavish mansions. So it was already a mixed community way back. Following decades, we started to see the streetcar network establish itself on our commercial streets, Robson, Davie, Denman. The streetcars brought with it some of the older pre-war apartments that we see still today, as well as a number of storefronts that started popping up along these streetcar routes. So we started to see more of an urbanization. 1957, this is an incredible photo for a lot of reasons. One of which is a photo of the West End, this area here, essentially right before it went through what was the largest transformation in its history, which was from 1957 up to about 1972. And we saw the West End transform from a predominantly low-rise community into very much a mixed community with around, from what we can tell, 220 high-rises built within 15 years. So this is really where a transformation took place and changed the character. That transformation is largely what we have today. In the 70s, the area was downzoned. We haven't seen a lot of change since. So a picture showing the West End from above shows that we still have a lot of those apartment buildings from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So when we look at the West End, we know it's about a third of the downtown peninsula. It represents 112 city blocks in size. 45,000 people live here. 23,000 people work here. It's one of the city's densest communities. It's the fourth densest. In the 80s, it was actually the densest in Vancouver, but it hasn't experienced a lot of growth, so it was surpassed by 3 others. But what we know in terms of who lives here is generally it's a young community. About half the population is between 20 and 39 years of age. And it's a modest income community. You can see here the median income of the West End as compared to the citywide average. We know that 81% of the households are rented, so that's a significant amount of rental. So significant that it actually makes up a third of the entire city rental stock. An incredible amount of rental in this one community. That rental stock, as you would guess from the historical images, was built primarily between the mid-50s and the early 1970s. So while we know that it's aging, we also know that the rental stock is actually in good shape. In terms of where it's located, the purple shows market rental sites. The light blue shows stratified sites, and the orange shows social housing sites. So you can see in the West End, in terms of rental, it's fairly distributed throughout the older residential areas, south of Davie, generally between Robson, Davie, and then west of Denman. From a heritage perspective, we have 121 heritage buildings in the West End. You can see them here. Includes quite a strong cluster in the Mole Hill area, Barclay Square, as well along Cardero Street. The building stock, primarily apartments, over 5 stories. If you look at the types of bedrooms in the stock, generally we have a lot of studios and 1 bedrooms in the West End. Not a lot of 2 bedrooms and very, very few 3 or more bedrooms. Even though we have one of the highest densities of children of any community within the city of Vancouver. It's remarkable. When you look at where people that live in the West End work, just over half work within the peninsula, the downtown peninsula itself. We've got a lot more working within the Metro Core area as well, and then we have some in the rest of Vancouver and the region heading out, but you can see the majority of them are actually right within this central area. And we notice that when we look at how people get to work, highest walk to work mode share of any community. A lot of people are walking. And if they're not walking, a lot of them are taking transit. In terms of looking at new jobs, we know in the next 20 years that we're going to see around 30,000 new jobs within the central business district area, which does extend partially into the West End. I'll cover that in a second. So there's a bit of the context. In terms of the plan itself, before I dive into the details of the plan, I really wanted to address the key elements. What is the plan? What are the elements that make up the West End Community Plan? Really, what we're looking at are 5. 1, the West End Community Plan is really a policy document. It sets out the policies that council needs to make their decisions, that planning staff and city staff need to undertake their work programs and make their types of decisions. It sets the policies that provide clarity for people living in a community. So there's certainty and clarity about how the community is going to grow, where it's going to grow, types of housing we need, where jobs will be focused, how we get around, the transportation improvements. Those are all policies that are contained within the community plan. What's new as part of the West End Community Plan that hasn't been done in the past within a community plan is what we're calling a public benefit strategy. So it's in the plan itself, and it's really a strategy that outlines how, or what are the public amenities and public benefits and the facilities that we have in the community that need to be renewed or expanded. And it sets the framework and starts to prioritize how we go about doing that, and sets out the funding sources for actually paying for this. One of the core elements of this West End Community Plan process comes as part of a lot of folks in the community being concerned about rezonings over the past 5+ years. So what we wanted to be sure we did, knowing that that was a huge concern, was be very clear as part of a rezoning policy, something that doesn't exist today in our current plan that was developed in 1986 and 87. We wanted to be very clear through a rezoning policy where they could occur in the future and what they would look like. Zoning. This is an implementation tool. As part of the West End Community Plan, we will be developing zoning that can help implement the policies of the plan itself. We're expected to bring the zoning out November 6th. And while the zoning doesn't actually form part of the plan, it's a very key piece of implementing the plan. Lastly, guidelines. Guidelines are really what shapes the form, the physical form of new development, of new buildings. So recognizing character is incredibly important to West Enders. We've developed a clear set of guidelines for the new infill, particularly in the neighborhood areas, which I'll touch on in a second. Okay, so those are the core elements. The West End Plan itself, right from the get-go, we heard that character was so important to framing how we looked at the West End and how we looked at future growth and development. So we framed up our emerging directions, our directions, and the West End Community Plan in its draft form around 3 character areas. Our villages, where we wanted to encourage vibrant local business areas. Our neighborhoods, where it was really about recognizing the established residential areas and maintaining the character that we have today, that green leafy character, the diversity of buildings that we have today. And looking at the corridors as opportunities to really accommodate a lot of the growth that we'll see in the West End. So this is the map that reflects the 3 character areas. We have the neighborhoods. We're using the historic neighborhoods. There's actually 4 in the West End. The 3 villages where we have Denman Village, Davie Village, Robson Village, and then the light blue areas, which are the corridor areas, primarily along the arterials, close to transit, close to the local businesses. And one of the things that we pulled together for our June directions sessions were looking at how would this policy direction that we have been contemplating as part of this process be landed. So we pulled this together. This is a 3D representation showing the existing buildings in really the browns, and then starting to drop in where the new development sites would be located under the new policy, and the scale. So this starts to give folks an idea of what the plan would look like if it was implemented over the next 30 years. It represents an additional 7,000 to 10,000 new residents, primarily along the corridors, and it represents another 7,000 jobs. And when I say jobs, primarily that's new office development in the Central Business District, as well as additional job space at the hospital, St. Paul's Hospital, which intends to expand. In terms of the physical layout, we have 4 commercial streets within the West End. We've shown Granville on here as well, very much tied in with the West End. And along these commercial streets, we start to see a series of what we call villages. And these were the areas we heard where we wanted to focus a lot of our attention on local business, creating really vibrant areas that help knit the residential areas of the community together. And what we've also looked at and worked with the BIA and local businesses and residents to develop is an idea called the West Loop. And this becomes a very walkable place that connects a series of places. series of villages, residential areas. It really becomes a place that weaves together a series of unique places and spaces, the villages, the residential areas, the high streets, the beach, major transit nodes. It becomes a place where people go to shop, work, or play. It's really a place for socializing or networking. It's a place that's interesting to walk, gather, or explore. It's a place that's vibrant and fun. It's a place that's about commerce meeting the sidewalk, having really active commercial sidewalks. A place that's viable for local businesses to thrive. And we've heard a lot about business turnover, particularly on Denman Street and some of the other streets. It's a place that attracts neighbors and visitors alike. So the loop really becomes about placemaking. It's about taking what we already have and just improving upon that, starting to better link together some of these really special places that we have. The villages, so Denman Village, Robson Village, Davie Village. As part of the plan, we've really defined a village as a low-scale business area. It embodies a distinct history, personality, and character. You'll notice Davie Village has a very different character than, say, Denman Village or Robson Village. Each one has its unique character. These places are walkable and provide local residents, people working in the area, St. Paul's, the office districts, or visitors alike, an attractive place to go and shop, hang out, meet friends. So the village strategy is really about placemaking. And we started to pilot some of the ideas. This is a shot of Davie Street. The plan. The plan for the village areas sets policies that retain the lower building heights, to be sidewalk sunny, allowing for patios, recognizing they're going to be active, busy places, they already are, in the early mornings, late into the evenings, limiting the amount of new residential that's going to be built above, so keeping them focused on local business, commercial. Extending the sidewalks as much as we can, looking at building setbacks as well as on corners, bulges and opportunities to expand that space. Right now, particularly on Denman, very, very tight. Looking at decorative lighting opportunities to start to give each of these streets a bit of a distinct character. We can look at lighting as a way to do that, improve the safety and improve the vibrancy of the street. The local BIA actually has piloted some new lighting down on Broughton and Robson Street. And there are string lights that run for the block. And that's one idea that's come up as an opportunity. Working with businesses and the BIAs around facade improvements. So recognizing we're not going to see a lot of change and redevelopment. It's important that these businesses look good, they're presenting themselves well to the street. So working on facade improvements. Increasing the opportunities for patios and activities on the street. Making sure we've got clear guidelines around weather protection. We're a very dark, rainy city, so that's a really important one. Regulating minimum commercial heights. So one of the things we know is some commercial spaces are designed with ceiling heights that are too low. They're not very adaptable in the future. It's very difficult to install venting or other requirements for, say, restaurants in the future or other types of uses in the future. So making sure there's a minimum. And making sure that the new retail, restaurants, activities are really focused within these core areas, these village areas. So in terms of the street cross-section within the plan, we've identified, really it's about 2 stories of commercial. The maximum height within the existing zoning is 60 feet, and that's being maintained. So what you see is generally your first floor 20 feet, your second floor is usually around 14 feet, and you may get a third floor at 14 feet. But generally it's the lower scale. So that's the village strategy. So, second thing I'll talk about are the neighborhoods, the purple areas. The established residential areas. We heard in these areas character was incredibly important.